The first horror story, The Phantom Camper. In the summer of 2024, a group of friends decided to go camping in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, adventure, and escape from their busy city lives. They had planned everything meticulously, from their campsite to their hiking trails. On the first night, as they sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, they heard the sound of footsteps in the distance. At first, they thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But the footsteps grew closer and more distinct, as if someone was deliberately walking towards them. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and there was an eerie silence. The friends looked at each other, uneasy, but trying to laugh it off. "Probably just a fellow camper," one of them suggested. They decided to ignore it and went to bed, though the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, they woke up to find something chilling. Outside their tents, in the dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh and circled their campsite, but there were no other campsites nearby. Disturbed, they decided to be more cautious, but continued with their planned activities. That evening, they noticed something even stranger. As they were hiking back to their campsite after a day exploring the trails, they saw a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, watching them. When they tried to call out to him, he disappeared into the woods without a sound. Frightened, they hurried back to their campsite and discussed whether they should leave. Ultimately, they decided to stay one more night, thinking it might just be a drifter or another camper playing tricks on them. As night fell, they huddled around the campfire, trying to stay calm. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Around midnight, they heard the footsteps again, closer this time. And then, in the flickering light of the fire, they saw him, a gaunt, pale man with wild eyes, standing at the edge of their campsite. Before anyone could react, he let out a blood-curdling scream and ran at them. The friends scattered, grabbing whatever they could. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, and without looking back, they sped away. Later, they learned that the area had a dark history. Years ago, a hermit had lived in those woods, shunned by the nearby townsfolk. He was known for his erratic behavior and had disappeared mysteriously. Locals believed his spirit haunted the forest, targeting campers and hikers. The friends never returned to those woods. The memory of that phantom camper and his terrifying scream stayed with them, a haunting reminder of their encounter with the unknown. The second horror story, The Silent Night in Yosemite. In the summer of 2021, Emily and her 3 friends decided to go on a camping trip to Yosemite National Park. They were all nature enthusiasts and had been planning this trip for months. The idea was to spend a few nights under the stars, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The first 2 nights went smoothly. They hiked during the day, swam in the river, and enjoyed the beauty of the park. On the 3rd night, they decided to camp deeper in the forest, in a more secluded area known for its tranquility and stunning views. After setting up their tents, they built a campfire and sat around it, sharing stories and laughter. As the night grew darker, they noticed how quiet it was. There were no sounds of crickets, owls, or any other usual nighttime noises. It felt unnaturally silent. Around midnight, they decided to call it a night. As they were getting into their tents, Emily thought she saw a shadow move near the edge of their campsite. She brushed it off as her imagination and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Emily was awakened by a soft rustling sound outside her tent. She listened intently, trying to determine what it was. The rustling grew louder and was followed by a faint whispering. It sounded like multiple voices, but she couldn't make out any words. Terrified, she stayed still, hoping it would go away. Suddenly, her tent zipper started to slowly open from the bottom. Emily held her breath, too scared to move. The zipper stopped halfway, and the whispering ceased. There was a long, eerie silence. Gathering her courage, Emily reached for her flashlight and shone it towards the zipper. There was nothing there. She quickly zipped the tent back up and lay awake, clutching the flashlight until morning. When the sun finally rose, Emily cautiously emerged from her tent and found her friends already awake, looking equally shaken. They all had similar experiences during the night: rustling sounds, whispers, and partially unzipped tents. Determined to leave, they quickly packed up their campsite. As they were hiking back to their car, they came across another group of campers who looked just as frightened. When they exchanged stories, they realized that everyone had experienced the same eerie phenomena that night. Later, they learned that the area they had camped in was near an old abandoned settlement from the 1800s. According to local legends, the settlers had mysteriously disappeared, and their spirits were said to haunt the forest, especially on quiet, moonless nights. Emily and her friends never camped in Yosemite again. The memories of that silent, terrifying night remained with them, a chilling reminder of the unknown presence that lurked in the dark. Third horror story: the Screaming Woods. In the fall of 2024, a group of college friends decided to go camping in the remote and infamous Screaming Woods in Kent, England. The woods had a dark reputation for being haunted, with tales of eerie sounds and unexplained disappearances. But the friends, intrigued by the stories, were eager for a spooky adventure. They arrived at the woods in the late afternoon and set up camp in a small clearing. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and trying to scare each other. The thick canopy of trees above made the night feel even darker and more foreboding. Around midnight, the friends decided to explore a bit, hoping to catch a glimpse of something supernatural. Armed with flashlights, they ventured deeper into the woods, following a narrow, winding path. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt colder, and an unsettling silence enveloped them. Suddenly, they heard a faint scream in the distance. They stopped, trying to pinpoint the direction it came from. The scream echoed again, closer this time. It was a chilling, human-like scream, filled with agony and fear. Panicked, the friends decided to head back to their campsite. But as they turned around, they realized they were lost. The path seemed to have disappeared, and the trees around them looked unfamiliar. The screams grew louder and more frequent, echoing through the woods from all directions. Desperate to find their way back, they stumbled through the forest, calling out to each other to stay together. The screams were relentless, and they started to hear other strange noises: whispers, footsteps, and rustling leaves. It felt like they were being watched and followed by something unseen. After what felt like hours of frantic wandering, they finally found their campsite. But their relief was short-lived. The campfire was extinguished, and their tents were torn apart, their belongings scattered across the ground. Terrified, they decided to leave immediately. They packed what they could and hurried back to their car, constantly looking over their shoulders. As they drove away, the screams seemed to follow them, fading only when they reached the edge of the woods. Back at the college, they researched the Screaming Woods and discovered a grim history. During the 18th century, the woods were the site of numerous executions, and the spirits of the executed were said to haunt the area, forever screaming in torment. The friends never returned to the Screaming Woods. The memory of that night, the relentless screams, and the feeling of being hunted stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the supernatural terror they encountered. Fourth horror story: the camping trip in Blackwood Forest. In the summer of 2024, a group of friends decided to go camping in Blackwood Forest, a dense, isolated forest known for its beauty and tranquility. They were excited to spend a few days disconnected from the world, enjoying nature. The first 2 days were perfect. They hiked, swam in a nearby lake, and enjoyed evenings by the campfire. On the third night, they decided to camp deeper in the forest, where few people ventured. They set up their tents in a small clearing and settled in for the night. Around midnight, they were startled awake by the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling. They assumed it was a deer or some other animal, but the sounds grew louder and closer. The friends huddled together, shining their flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. Suddenly, they heard a low, guttural growl, followed by heavy footsteps. Panic set in. One of the friends, Mark, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a camping knife, he slowly walked towards the noise. The others watched nervously, their flashlights darting around the clearing. Mark disappeared into the trees, and for a few minutes there was silence. Then they heard a blood-curdling scream. Mark came running back, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He couldn't speak, just pointed into the forest. They grabbed their gear and decided to leave immediately. As they hurriedly packed, they heard the growl again, closer this time. They turned to see a large, shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. It had glowing eyes and moved with an unnatural, jerky motion. They bolted, running through the forest, not stopping until they reached their car. Breathless and terrified, they drove to the nearest town and reported what had happened to the local authorities. The ranger they spoke to was skeptical, but agreed to check it out. The next day, they received a call from the ranger, who told them there was no sign of any large animal or person in the area where they had camped. Determined to understand what they encountered, the friends did some research and discovered that Blackwood Forest had a history of strange occurrences. Over the years, several campers had reported seeing a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, always followed by strange growls and unexplained disappearances. Shaken but relieved to be safe, they vowed never to return to Blackwood Forest. The memory of that night, the terrifying figure, and the unearthly growls stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the unknown dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Fifth horror story: the disappearing hiker in Red River Gorge. In the spring of 2024, Sarah and her friends decided to go camping in Red River Gorge, a beautiful and rugged area in Kentucky known for its scenic views and challenging trails. They planned a 3-day trip, excited to explore the stunning rock formations and dense forests. On their second day, they decided to hike to a remote area called Chimney Top Rock. The trail was steep and challenging, but the view from the top was supposed to be worth it. They set off early in the morning, each carrying a small backpack with essentials. Halfway through the hike, they met a solo hiker named Jack. He was friendly and asked if he could join them, as he wasn't familiar with the area. They welcomed him, and together they continued the hike, chatting and sharing stories along the way. As they approached Chimney Top Rock, they noticed the forest growing thicker and darker. The path became less distinct, and they had to rely on their GPS to stay on track. Jack seemed to know a lot about the area's history and legends, sharing tales of mysterious disappearances and ghost sightings. When they finally reached the top, the view was breathtaking. They spent some time taking pictures and enjoying the scenery. As the sun began to set, they decided to head back to their campsite. Jack mentioned he wanted to stay a bit longer to take some more photos and assured them he would be fine. They said their goodbyes and started the descent. As they hiked back, the forest seemed even more foreboding. Shadows lengthened, and an eerie silence settled over the woods. They quickened their pace, eager to reach their campsite before dark. Back at the campsite, they noticed something strange. Jack's tent was there, but it looked old and worn, as if it had been abandoned for years. Confused, they called out for Jack but received no response. They decided to wait, thinking he might arrive later. As night fell, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She and her friends gathered around the campfire, trying to make sense of the situation. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching. Relieved, they turned to see Jack, but he looked different. His clothes were tattered, and his face was pale and gaunt. Before they could ask what happened, Jack said in a hollow voice, "I've been lost in these woods for years. I can't find my way out." Then, he disappeared into the darkness. Terrified, they packed up their gear and left immediately. They reported the incident to the park rangers, who investigated but found no trace of Jack. They later learned that years ago, a hiker named Jack had gone missing in Red River Gorge, and his body was never found. Haunted by the encounter, Sarah and her friends never returned to Red River Gorge. The memory of Jack's ghostly appearance and his desperate words stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the forest's dark secrets. Friday Horror Story: The Echoes of Shadow Lake. In the summer of 2024, a group of friends, Lisa, Tom, Emma, and David, decided to go camping near Shadow Lake, a remote and serene spot in the Pacific Northwest. The lake was surrounded by dense forest and had a reputation for its untouched beauty. They were excited to spend a few days in nature, away from the noise of their everyday lives. The first 2 days were perfect. They swam in the lake, fished, and hiked the nearby trails. On the third night, they decided to camp on the far side of the lake, where fewer people ventured. They set up their tents close to the water and built a campfire. As the sun set, they noticed an odd stillness in the air. The usual sounds of the forest were absent: no birds, no insects, just silence. They brushed it off and continued to enjoy their evening, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Around midnight, as they were getting ready to sleep, they heard a faint echoing voice coming from the lake. It sounded like someone calling for help. Concerned, they grabbed their flashlights and walked to the water's edge, scanning the dark surface. There was no one in sight. The voice called out again, clearer this time, but still distant and eerie. "Help me," it echoed. They tried to pinpoint the source, but couldn't see anything. David suggested it might be a prank, but Emma insisted they should check it out, just in case. Reluctantly, they took the canoe and paddled towards the center of the lake, following the voice. The closer they got, the more distinct the voice became. It sounded desperate and pained. As they reached the middle of the lake, the voice suddenly stopped, and an eerie silence fell over them. Lisa shone her flashlight around, and to their horror, they saw a pale face just beneath the water's surface, staring up at them with empty eyes. Panicked, they paddled back to shore as fast as they could. When they reached land, they ran to their campsite, breathless and shaken. They decided to leave immediately. As they were packing, the voice called out again, this time from the shore. "Help me." They turned to see a figure standing at the water's edge. It was a woman, drenched and pale, her eyes hollow and haunting. She disappeared as they shone their flashlights on her. They didn't wait any longer, quickly packing up their tents and gear and driving away from Shadow Lake. The drive back was silent, each of them processing the terrifying encounter. Later, they discovered that years ago, a woman had drowned in Shadow Lake under mysterious circumstances. Locals believed her spirit haunted the lake, calling out to campers and hikers, seeking help that never came. The friends never returned to Shadow Lake. The memory of the haunting voice and the ghostly figure stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the supernatural presence that lurked in the depths of the lake. Seventh story: The Vanishing Campfire in Pine Creek Woods. In the fall of 2024, 4 friends, Megan, Alex, Jason, and Carla decided to spend a weekend camping in Pine Creek Woods, a vast and remote forest known for its picturesque landscapes and serene atmosphere. The forest had a reputation for its beauty, but also for strange, unexplained occurrences. Intrigued and eager for an adventure, they set off on their trip. They arrived at their chosen campsite, a secluded spot near a small, babbling creek, late in the afternoon. They quickly set up their tents and gathered firewood for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they built a large campfire and settled in for an evening of stories and laughter. As they sat around the fire, Jason began telling a local legend he had read about. According to the story, Pine Creek Woods was haunted by the spirit of an old hermit who had lived there centuries ago. The hermit was said to have been a recluse, living off the land and rarely seen by others. After his mysterious death, people claimed to see his ghostly figure wandering the woods, and strange things happened near his former home, which had long since decayed. The friends laughed nervously at the tale, trying to shake off the eerie feeling it left them with. As the night grew darker, they decided to call it a night and headed to their tents. The fire was still burning brightly, casting long shadows around the campsite. Around midnight, Megan was awakened by the sound of footsteps outside her tent. At first, she thought it was one of her friends, but the footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the campfire. She listened intently, and then she heard a faint, raspy whisper, "Leave this place." Terrified, she unzipped her tent and peeked outside. The campfire was out, reduced to cold, blackened logs, though they had left it burning strongly. There was no one in sight, and her friends' tents were still zipped up. She woke Alex, who reluctantly got up to check the campfire with her. As they stood near the cold ashes, they felt an icy chill in the air, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. They decided to wake Jason and Carla, and the four of them huddled together, trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly, they noticed something strange. Around the campfire in the dirt were footprints, human footprints, but they weren't theirs, and they formed a perfect circle around the fire pit. Deciding they had had enough, they quickly packed their gear and prepared to leave. As they were loading the car, they heard the raspy whisper again, louder this time, "Leave this place." They didn't need any more encouragement. They jumped in the car and drove away as fast as they could. Back in town, they told their story to a local ranger, who listened with a serious expression. He confirmed that strange things often happened in Pine Creek Woods, especially near the area where the hermit had supposedly lived and died. No one knew why, but the stories and sightings persisted. Megan, Alex, Jason, and Carla never returned to Pine Creek Woods. The memory of that night, the ghostly whisper, and the mysterious footprints haunted them, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that still lingered in those dark, ancient woods. Eighth story, The Watcher of Whispering Pines. In the spring of 2024, a group of friends, Ben, Lucy, Ryan, and Sophie, decided to go camping in Whispering Pines, a secluded and beautiful forest known for its tall pine trees and serene lakes. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences in the area, but they brushed them off as local legends and ghost stories. They arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon and set up their tents near a picturesque lake. The first day was perfect. They swam, fished, and hiked. As night fell, they built a campfire and gathered around it, sharing stories and enjoying the peace and quiet. Around midnight, as they were about to go to bed, they heard a faint rustling in the trees. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was as if someone or something was moving through the forest, slowly and deliberately. "Probably just an animal," Ryan said, trying to reassure everyone. They decided to ignore it and went to their tents. But the rustling continued, closer and closer. Ben, who was a light sleeper, was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of footsteps outside his tent. He froze, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and heavy, circling the campsite. Gathering his courage, he unzipped his tent just a little to peek outside. What he saw chilled him to the bone. A tall, shadowy figure stood at the edge of the campfire's dying light, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It was watching them, motionless and silent. Ben quickly zipped up his tent and whispered to the others to wake up. They all gathered in the center of the campsite, their flashlights scanning the darkness. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. They decided to stay up for the rest of the night, keeping the fire burning bright. As dawn approached, the feeling of unease began to fade, and they decided to stay another night, hoping the events of the night before were just their imagination. The next day passed uneventfully, and by evening, they had almost forgotten about the previous night's scare. But as night fell, the rustling in the trees began again. This time, it was accompanied by a soft, whispering sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Determined to find the source, Ben and Ryan grabbed their flashlights and walked towards the sound, leaving Lucy and Sophie at the campsite. They ventured deeper into the forest, following the whispers. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and they found themselves in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered stone, covered in strange symbols. As they examined the stone, they heard the footsteps again, coming from all directions. They turned around to see multiple shadowy figures emerging from the trees, all watching them silently. Panicked, they ran back to the campsite as fast as they could. When they reached the campsite, Lucy and Sophie were already packing up their gear. They had heard the whispers and seen the figures too. Without a word, they all quickly packed up and left Whispering Pines. Back in town, they researched the area and discovered that the forest was once home to a small, isolated community that had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. Locals believed the spirits of the community still roamed the forest, watching anyone who ventured too close to their resting place. Ben, Lucy, Ryan, and Sophie never returned to Whispering Pines. The memory of the shadowy figures and the eerie whispers stayed with them, a haunting reminder of the mysterious presence that lurked in the forest. Ninth story, The Haunting of Black Hollow Campground. In the autumn of 2024, a group of friends, Tom, Emily, Jake, and Rachel, decided to take a camping trip to Black Hollow Campground, an isolated spot deep in the woods of northern Maine. The campground was known for its breathtaking fall foliage and quiet atmosphere, making it the perfect getaway for the group. They arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, setting up their tents and preparing for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and relaxing by the campfire. As the sun set, they lit a fire and sat around it, sharing stories and enjoying the peaceful surroundings. Around p.m., as they were about to turn in for the night, they heard a distant, eerie wail echo through the forest. It sounded almost like a woman crying. They brushed it off as a wild animal, but the sound left them all feeling uneasy. During the night, Emily was woken by the sound of soft sobbing outside her tent. She peeked through the flap but saw nothing. The sobbing continued, seeming to come from different directions. She woke Tom, who listened for a moment before deciding it was just the wind playing tricks on them. The next morning, they mentioned the sounds to the campground manager when they went to get more firewood. The manager's face turned serious. He told them about the legend of Black Hollow Campground. Years ago, a young woman named Mary had disappeared while camping there with her family. Her body was never found, and locals believed her spirit still wandered the forest, crying out for help. Despite the unsettling story, the group decided to stay, dismissing it as just a legend. They spent the day hiking and exploring the area, trying to shake off the eerie feeling from the night before. That evening, As they sat around the campfire, the sobbing started again, louder and more persistent. This time, it was unmistakable. It was a woman's cry, full of sorrow and despair. The friends decided to investigate, grabbing their flashlights and cautiously walking toward the sound. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sobbing grew louder. They reached a clearing where the sobbing stopped abruptly. In the center of the clearing, they saw a faint glowing figure of a woman. She was dressed in old-fashioned camping clothes, her face pale and eyes filled with tears. She looked at them and whispered, "Help me." Suddenly, the figure vanished, and the sobbing started again, coming from all around them. Terrified, they ran back to their campsite, packed up their gear as quickly as they could, and left the campground. Back in town, they researched more about Mary's disappearance. They found out that her family had camped in the same area they had. Mary had gone missing after wandering off to gather firewood, and despite an extensive search, she was never found. The group never returned to Black Hollow Campground. The memory of Mary's ghostly figure and her sorrowful cries haunted them, a chilling reminder of the unexplained mysteries that lurk in the quietest of places. 10th story, The Phantom Lights of Raven Rock. In the summer of 2024, 4 friends Max, Sarah, Kevin, and Jenna decided to go camping at Raven Rock, a remote and rugged area in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was known for its stunning views and challenging trails, but also for mysterious lights that some campers claimed to have seen at night. Intrigued by the stories, the friends were eager to experience the adventure firsthand. They arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon and set up their camp on a high ridge overlooking the valley below. The first day was perfect. They hiked, took photos, and enjoyed the scenic beauty. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, sharing laughter and stories about the supposed lights. Around midnight, just as they were about to call it a night, Kevin noticed something strange. In the distance, faint blue lights flickered among the trees. He pointed them out to the others, and they all watched in silent awe as the lights moved slowly and rhythmically. "Probably just other campers with flashlights," Max said, trying to sound confident. But the lights didn't behave like flashlights. They moved in patterns, weaving in and out of the trees, sometimes vanishing and then reappearing in different spots. Intrigued and a bit spooked, the friends decided to investigate. They grabbed their flashlights and cautiously made their way towards the lights. As they got closer, the lights seemed to retreat further into the forest, leading them deeper and deeper into the woods. After what felt like an hour of walking, they reached a clearing where the lights suddenly vanished. The air was still, and an eerie silence enveloped the forest. They stood there, confused and on edge, when they heard a faint humming sound, almost like distant singing. Sarah shone her flashlight around the clearing and gasped. In the middle of the clearing was an old, weathered stone circle, partially covered in moss and vines. The humming grew louder, and the air grew colder. The friends exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had stumbled upon something ancient and unexplained. Suddenly, the blue lights reappeared, surrounding them in a perfect circle. The humming intensified, and the lights began to pulse in time with the sound. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. Jenna, with her voice trembling, suggested they leave immediately. They turned to leave, but the lights blocked their path. In a desperate attempt, Max shouted, "We mean no harm. We'll leave now." To their relief, the lights slowly receded, creating a narrow path for them to escape. They hurried back to their campsite, not looking back. Once they reached the safety of their tents, the lights disappeared completely. The humming stopped, and the forest returned to its usual quiet. The next morning, they packed up and left Raven Rock, still shaken by the night's events. Back in town, they shared their experience with a local historian, who told them about the legend of the Raven Rock Lights. According to the legend, the lights were the spirits of an ancient tribe that once lived in the area. The stone circle was believed to be a sacred site, and the spirits guarded it fiercely. Max, Sarah, Kevin, and Jenna never returned to Raven Rock. The memory of the mysterious lights and the eerie humming haunted them, a chilling reminder of the supernatural forces that still lingered in the old, forgotten corners of the world.